Imagine the look on Officer Davis's face when he realized he'd just arrested a top-ranking military officer for the crime of walking while black. Talk about a career-limiting move. While there's nothing funny about discrimination, this story takes some surprising turns that highlight the ridiculous nature of racial assumptions. As we navigate the tense and often frustrating journey of General Adams, we'll find moments of irony and even dark humor that underscore the ultimate message. Judging people by their appearance is not just wrong, it's often hilariously misguided. General Michael Adams strolled down the tree-lined streets of his affluent neighborhood, his polished shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the sidewalk. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across manicured lawns and stately homes. Adams breathed in the crisp autumn air, his mind wandering to the upcoming military strategy meeting he would chair next week. A few blocks away, Officer James Davis cruised in his patrol car, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. The wealthy enclave rarely saw serious crime, but Davis prided himself on staying vigilant. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, a figure caught his attention. A black man in casual clothes walked alone, seemingly out of place in this predominantly white neighborhood. Davis's brow furrowed as he watched Adams. Something about the man's presence set off alarm bells in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this individual didn't belong here. His hand tightened on the steering wheel as he made the decision to investigate further. Adams noticed the police cruiser slowing down nearby. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, quickly replaced by a calm mask of indifference. He'd experienced this before. The suspicious glances, the unwarranted scrutiny. Taking a deep breath, he continued walking, his pace steady and unhurried. The patrol car's tires crunched on the pavement as Davis pulled up alongside Adams. The officer's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. "Excuse me, sir. Can I have a word with you?" Adams turned to face the officer, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. Years of military training kicked in as he assessed the situation, noting Davis's tense posture and narrowed gaze. He knew this encounter could quickly spiral out of control if he wasn't careful. "Of course, officer," Adams replied, his voice steady and respectful, despite the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "How can I help you?" As the two men locked eyes, the air crackled with tension. Neither could have predicted how this seemingly routine stop would alter the course of their lives and ignite a firestorm of controversy. In that moment, on that quiet suburban street, the stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the deep-rooted biases lurking beneath the surface of their community. The crackling tension between Adams and Davis was about to ignite. What should have been a brief exchange was poised to become a pivotal moment in both men's lives. How far would Officer Davis push, and at what cost? Officer Davis's voice cut through the air, sharp and demanding. "I'm going to need to see some identification, sir. You're engaging in suspicious activity in this area." Adams's eyebrows rose slightly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Davis's growing agitation. "Suspicious activity? I'm simply taking a walk in my own neighborhood. I live just down the street. May I ask why you need to see my ID?" Davis's jaw tightened, his frustration mounting at Adams's composed response. He had expected compliance, not questions. "Listen, I don't make the rules. When an officer asks for ID, you provide it. It's for everyone's safety." Adams took a deep breath, weighing his options. He knew his rights, understood that he wasn't legally required to show identification unless he was being lawfully detained or arrested, but he also recognized the precarious nature of the situation. "Officer, I respect your position, but I don't believe I'm legally obligated to show you my ID without probable cause. Can you explain what specific suspicious activity you observed?" Davis's face flushed, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his holster. "Look, I'm not going to stand here and argue with you. Either you show me some ID right now, or we're going to have a problem. Your choice." The threat hung in the air between them. Adam's mind raced, considering the potential consequences of refusing. He thought of his family, his career, the countless other black men who had found themselves in similar situations with far worse outcomes. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for his wallet. "I want to be clear that I'm providing this under protest," Adams said, his voice steady as he handed over his driver's license. I don't believe this stop is justified. Davis snatched the ID, his eyes widening slightly as he read the name and address. He retreated to his patrol car, leaving Adams standing on the sidewalk, acutely aware of curious glances from passing neighbors. Minutes ticked by as Davis ran the license through the system. Adams stood motionless, his military training evident in his rigid posture. Finally, Davis emerged from the car, Adams' ID in hand. "Everything checks out," Davis said grudgingly, returning the license. "But I still don't like your attitude. You should be more cooperative with law enforcement in the future." Adams accepted his ID, his expression unreadable. "Officer, I've been nothing but respectful. I hope you'll reflect on why you found my presence here so suspicious." Davis's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint flickering in their depths. In that moment, a fateful decision crystallized in his mind, one that would set in motion a chain of events neither man could have anticipated. In the blink of an eye, a routine stop was about to become a national headline. What invisible line had Michael Adams crossed in Officer Davis's mind, and how would this moment reshape the conversation on racial profiling in America? Davis's face contorted with frustration, his patience wearing thin. The general's composed demeanor only seemed to fuel his anger. In a split second, Davis made a decision that would alter both their lives. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," he barked, reaching for his handcuffs. Adams' eyes widened in disbelief. "Officer, on what grounds are you arresting me?" he asked, his voice steady despite the shock coursing through him. Davis hesitated, struggling to articulate a valid reason. For resisting an officer," he stammered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Tension crackled in the air as neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Several pulled out their phones, instinctively recording the unfolding scene. Adams stood still, acutely aware of the eyes upon him and the potential consequences of any sudden movement. "Officer Davis," Adams said, his tone measured but firm, "I want to be clear that I have not resisted you in any way. I've complied with your request while asserting my rights as a citizen. This arrest is unlawful." Despite his calm exterior, Adams' heart raced, years of military training barely containing the anger and fear threatening to overwhelm him. Davis ignored Adams' words, roughly grabbing his arms and securing the handcuffs. The cold metal bit into Adams' wrists, a stark reminder of the injustice unfolding. As Davis recited the Miranda rights, Adams scanned the growing crowd, noting the mix of shock, confusion, and concern on their faces. The gravity of the situation sank in as Davis guided Adams toward the patrol car. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding or an overzealous officer. It was a blatant abuse of power, one that would have far-reaching consequences. As Adams ducked his head to enter the back seat, he caught sight of his reflection in the car window. The face of a decorated general stared back at him, now reduced to a suspect in the eyes of the law. As the car door slammed shut, Adams took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He knew that this moment would ripple far beyond this quiet suburban street. It would spark conversations about racial bias, police accountability, and the deep-rooted prejudices that still plague their society. As the patrol car pulled away, leaving behind a stunned neighborhood, the first waves of that ripple effect began to spread, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge the very foundations of justice in their community. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on Officer Davis's face as he began processing his arrest. But in the corridors of power, a storm was brewing. Who would be the first to recognize the gravity of Davis's mistake, and what would be the consequences? General Michael Adams stood tall at the booking desk, his military bearing evident despite the handcuffs encircling his wrists. He remained silent as Davis rattled off questions, his responses clipped and precise. The officer's smug satisfaction was palpable as he filled out the paperwork, oblivious to the tempest about to engulf him. As Davis led Adams to the fingerprinting station, other officers in the precinct began to take notice. Something about the arrestee's demeanor seemed off. There was a quiet dignity, an air of authority that seemed at odds with his current situation. Whispers started to circulate, curious glances thrown in their direction. Detective Sarah Martinez was the first to put the pieces together. Her eyes widened as recognition dawned, and she quickly made her way to Sergeant Laura Smith's office. Sarge, she said, her voice urgent, you need to see this. I think Officer Davis just brought in General Michael Adams. Smith's head snapped up, disbelief etched across her features. General Adams? The decorated Army general who lives on Maple Avenue? She was on her feet in an instant, striding purposefully towards the booking area. The atmosphere in the station shifted palpably as Smith approached. Davis, still oblivious, was in the middle of taking Adams' fingerprints when Smith's voice cut through the air like a whip. Officer Davis, step away from the arrestee immediately. Davis looked up, confusion evident on his face. Sergeant, I said step away, Smith repeated, her tone brooking no argument. She turned to Adams, her expression a mix of shock and mortification. General Adams, sir, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this situation. Please allow me to remove those handcuffs. As Smith freed Adams from the restraints, the reality of the situation began to sink in for everyone present. Officers nearby stood frozen, their faces a mixture of horror and disbelief. Davis, his complexion ashen, stumbled back against the wall as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. Adams rubbed his wrists, his gaze level as he addressed Smith. Sergeant, I appreciate your intervention. However, this incident raises serious questions about the practices and biases within your department. The station fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. In that moment, it was clear to everyone present that the consequences of this wrongful arrest would extend far beyond the walls of the precinct. As Sergeant Smith began to apologize profusely and explain the next steps, the first tremors of a seismic shift in departmental policy and community relations began to ripple outward. Sergeant Smith's voice cut through the tense atmosphere like a blade. Release General Adams immediately, she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. As an officer hurried to comply, Smith turned to Adams, her face a mask of contrition. General, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for this inexcusable incident. Davis stood rooted to the spot, the color draining from his face as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. His eyes darted between Smith and Adams, searching for words that wouldn't come. The bustling precinct had fallen eerily silent, every officer acutely aware of the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. Smith's gaze locked onto Davis, her eyes blazing with barely contained fury. Officer Davis, explain yourself. Now! Her words hung in the air, sharp and demanding. Davis opened his mouth, then closed it again, his mind scrambling for justification. I thought he looked suspicious, he finally stammered, the words sounding hollow and pathetic even to his own ears. Suspicious? Smith's voice dripped with disbelief and disappointment. Based on what, exactly? She pressed, forcing Davis to confront his biases head-on. As Davis fumbled through a series of weak explanations, each more damning than the last, the depth of his prejudice became painfully clear to everyone present. Smith's anger was palpable, her body tense as she listened to Davis's feeble attempts at justification. When he finally fell silent, she took a deep breath, visibly struggling to maintain her composure. Officer Davis, your actions today have not only violated departmental policy, but have also betrayed the trust of the very community we're sworn to protect. Her words rang out in the hushed precinct, heavy with the weight of their implications. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full investigation, Smith declared, her tone leaving no room for argument. Davis's shoulders slumped, the reality of his situation sinking in. As he was led away, the shock on his face mirrored that of his fellow officers, all grappling with the sudden upheaval of their perceived norms. In the wake of Davis's departure, Adams stepped forward, his demeanor calm but resolute. Sergeant Smith, he began, his voice steady and measured. While I appreciate your swift action, this incident highlights a much larger issue. The room hung on his every word as he continued. Racial profiling isn't just about one officer or one department. It's a systemic problem that demands our immediate and ongoing attention. As Adams spoke, addressing the broader implications of what had transpired, a shift began to take place in the atmosphere of the precinct. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably as they were forced to confront their own potential biases. It was clear to all present that this incident would be a turning point, not just for their department, but for the entire community. In the wake of General Adams' arrest, news spread through the police department like wildfire. Officers huddled in small groups, their hushed voices a mix of disbelief and concern. Some shook their heads in dismay, while others defended Davis, arguing that he was just doing his job. The precinct buzzed with nervous energy as the full implications of the incident began to sink in. Outside the station walls, word of the unjust arrest quickly reached the community. Social media exploded with outraged posts and calls for action. Local news vans converged on the precinct, their satellite dishes stretching toward the sky like accusing fingers. The pressure mounted as journalists clamored for statements and concerned citizens began to gather on the sidewalk, their angry voices carrying through the station's windows. Sergeant Smith strode through the corridors, her face set in grim determination. She barked orders to her staff, organizing an emergency meeting in the largest conference room. As officers filed in, the tension was palpable. Some avoided eye contact, while others whispered furiously to their colleagues. Smith stood at the head of the table, her hands planted firmly on its surface as she surveyed the room. Meanwhile, General Adams sat in a quiet office, weighing his options. He knew his response would be crucial in shaping the narrative and pushing for real change. His military training urged caution and strategy, but the anger simmering beneath the surface demanded immediate action. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath as he considered the best path forward. Back in the conference room, Smith's voice cut through the murmurs. "What happened today is unacceptable," she began, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We've failed not just General Adams, but our entire community." She outlined a series of immediate measures: mandatory bias training for all officers, a review of stop and frisk policies, and the formation of a community oversight committee. The room fell silent as the weight of these changes settled on the assembled officers. As Smith concluded her address, a sense of unease permeated the precinct. Officers exchanged worried glances, aware that the coming days would bring intense scrutiny and potential upheaval. The department braced itself for the inevitable storm of public outcry and demands for accountability. Outside, the crowd of protesters had grown larger, their chants echoing through the streets. Local community leaders arrived, demanding meetings with department officials. As night fell, the glow of news cameras illuminated the scene, broadcasting the unfolding drama to living rooms across the city. What had begun as a single misguided arrest was rapidly evolving into a watershed moment for police-community relations. The eyes of the nation were turning towards this quiet suburban precinct, waiting to see how they would respond to this critical test of justice and accountability. As the spotlight intensified, all eyes turned to General Adams. How would this decorated military leader respond to an injustice that reflected the experiences of countless others? His next move had the potential to reshape the national conversation on racial profiling and police reform. In the quiet of his study, General Adams sat at his desk, fingers poised over his keyboard. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders as he crafted his public statement. He knew his words needed to strike a delicate balance, conveying the raw emotion of his personal experience while also issuing a broader call for systemic change. Outside, news vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical sunflowers. Reporters paced the sidewalk, phones pressed to their ears as they chased leads and sound bites. The story of a high-ranking military officer racially profiled in his own neighborhood had ignited a media firestorm, and every outlet clamored for an exclusive. Adams's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from community leaders seeking his input. He scheduled a series of meetings, knowing that their perspectives would be crucial in framing the larger issues at play. As he listened to their stories, tales of similar encounters, of fear and frustration passed down through generations, the urgency of the moment crystallized in his mind. At the police precinct, an uneasy silence had fallen. Officers cast furtive glances at the television mounted in the corner, dreading the moment when Adams would break his silence. Some feared retribution, while others hoped his words might offer a path forward through the quagmire of distrust and bias. When the time came for Adams to deliver his speech, the nation held its collective breath. He stood at the podium, his posture ramrod straight, eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. What happened to me, he began, his voice steady and resolute, is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a deeper, systemic problem that has plagued our nation for far too long. As Adams spoke, he wove together personal anecdotes with hard data on racial disparities in policing. He called for increased accountability, better training, and a fundamental shift in how law enforcement engages with communities of color. His words resonated deeply, striking chords with both civilians who had long felt unheard and officers who recognized the need for change. This is not about one bad apple, Adams declared, his voice rising with conviction. This is about dismantling a system that allows prejudice to masquerade as protocol. We must do better. We must be better. As the general's speech concluded, a palpable shift rippled through the audience. Community members nodded in solemn agreement, while several officers stood, applauding with a newfound determination in their eyes. Adams's measured yet powerful words had transformed a local incident into a national rallying cry for police reform. In the days that followed, Adams' speech became a touchstone in discussions about racial profiling and law enforcement practices. News programs dissected his words, pundits debated his proposals, and lawmakers cited his experience as they drafted new legislation. What had begun as one man's unjust arrest had evolved into a watershed moment, forcing America to confront long-ignored truths about race, power, and justice. While the nation grappled with Adams' powerful message, one police department stood at a crossroads. Could a single incident truly transform an entire system, or would old habits prove too deeply entrenched? Sergeant Laura Smith wasted no time initiating a comprehensive review of the department's policies and practices. Her office became a hub of activity, filled with stacks of reports and policy manuals. She pored over each document, highlighting areas that needed immediate attention. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders as she crafted a plan to reshape the department's culture from the ground up. Within days, Smith announced mandatory training sessions on racial bias and de-escalation techniques for all officers. The tension in the precinct was palpable as officers filed into the conference room for the first session. Some sat with arms crossed, skepticism etched on their faces, while others leaned forward, eager to learn. As the trainer delved into topics of implicit bias and systemic racism, heated discussions erupted. Voices rose and fell as officers grappled with uncomfortable truths about their own perceptions and behaviors. Smith brought in external experts to assess the department's culture, their presence adding to the unease that permeated the station. These consultants observed interactions, conducted interviews, and scrutinized past incident reports. Their probing questions forced officers to confront long-held assumptions and practices that had gone unchallenged for years. Officer Davis's case became a central point of discussion in training sessions. Trainers used body cam footage and incident reports to break down the encounter, analyzing each decision point. Many officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they recognized their own potential for similar missteps. The raw emotions stirred by these discussions lingered long after the sessions ended, sparking conversations in break rooms and patrol cars. As weeks passed, Smith implemented new accountability measures and reporting systems. Officers were now required to document the reason for each stop, use of force incident, and arrest in detail. Body cameras became mandatory for all interactions with the public. A civilian review board was established to provide community oversight of police conduct. Gradually, a shift in departmental culture began to take root. Officers who initially resisted the changes found themselves outnumbered by colleagues who embraced the new focus on community trust. During briefings, sergeants emphasized de-escalation techniques and community engagement, alongside traditional law enforcement priorities. The ripple effects of change spread beyond the police department. Community leaders noticed a difference in their interactions with officers. Local businesses reported feeling more supported rather than targeted. Schools invited officers to participate in youth programs, fostering positive relationships with the next generation. As Smith watched these changes unfold, she felt a mix of pride and determination. The journey was far from over, but each small step forward brought them closer to the kind of department their community deserved. The incident that had shaken their foundations was now becoming the catalyst for meaningful, lasting change. The police department's community forum buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed into the high school auditorium. Sergeant Laura Smith stood at the entrance, greeting people with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The weight of recent events hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that set everyone on edge. General Michael Adams arrived, his presence causing a ripple of whispers through the crowd. He nodded to Smith before taking his seat near the front, his back straight and eyes focused on the empty stage. As the last stragglers found their places, Smith made her way to the podium, clearing her throat to quiet the murmurs. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her chest. "We're here to listen, to learn, and to work together towards real change in our community." She gestured to Adams, inviting him to speak. The general stood, his gaze sweeping across the room as he recounted his experience. His words, measured yet powerful, struck a chord with many in the audience. Heads nodded in grim recognition as he described the fear and frustration of being profiled in his own neighborhood. As Adams concluded, the floodgates opened. Community members rose one by one, years of pent-up grievances pouring out in a torrent of emotion. An elderly woman's voice shook as she described her grandson's encounter with overzealous officers. A young man's eyes flashed with anger as he recounted being pulled over for the third time in a month, no reason given. Officers in the audience shifted uncomfortably, some defensive, others beginning to see their actions through a new lens. One veteran cop stood, his face etched with remorse as he admitted to his own biases and pledged to do better. Smith and Adams worked in tandem, guiding the conversations when they threatened to veer into unproductive territory. They encouraged both sides to listen, to seek understanding even in the face of deep-seated mistrust. As the hours passed, something remarkable began to emerge from the raw honesty of these exchanges. Concrete ideas for change took shape. A citizen review board for police conduct, increased de-escalation training for officers, and community policing initiatives to foster positive relationships. By the time the forum concluded, a cautious sense of hope had begun to replace the initial tension. Residents and officers lingered, continuing discussions in small groups. Smith watched, a glimmer of optimism in her eyes as she saw bridges being built where only chasms had existed before. As people filed out into the cool night air, there was a shared understanding that this was only the beginning. The real work lay ahead in implementing and sustaining these changes. But for the first time in recent memory, both the police and the community they served were facing that challenge together. The air of cautious optimism following the community forum was about to be put to the test. As the internal investigation into Officer Davis's conduct concluded, a pivotal moment loomed on the horizon. Would the department's actions match their promises of change, or would old habits prove too deeply entrenched? Officer James Davis sat in his dimly lit apartment, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. His fingers drummed an erratic rhythm on the kitchen table as he replayed the fateful encounter with General Adams in his mind. The realization of his mistake had hit him like a physical blow, and now he waited, suspended in limbo, for the department's verdict. At the police station, Sergeant Laura Smith pored over the final report, her brow furrowed in concentration. The evidence was damning, leaving little room for interpretation. Davis's actions had been a clear violation of department standards, unprofessional and uncalled for. Smith's jaw tightened as she considered the implications of the decision she was about to make. Across town, General Michael Adams received a call from the department. They wanted his input on the appropriate response to Davis's misconduct. Adams paused, weighing his words carefully. He understood the broader implications of this moment, how it would be seen as a litmus test for the department's commitment to real change. The community held its collective breath as rumors of the impending announcement spread. Local activists gathered outside the police station, their signs demanding justice and accountability. News vans lined the street, reporters poised to break the story the moment it dropped. Inside the station, officers huddled in small groups, their voices low and tense. Some defended Davis, arguing that he had simply made a mistake. Others recognized the need for a clear message, even if it meant losing one of their own. Finally, Sergeant Smith stepped out to face the waiting crowd. Her voice steady, she announced the department's decision. Officer James Davis has been formally dismissed from the police force, she stated, her words sending a ripple through the assembled crowd. His actions were a violation of our standards and the trust placed in us by the community we serve. The decision sent shockwaves through the department and the city at large. For many in the community, it was a long-awaited sign that their voices had finally been heard. Inside the station, the atmosphere shifted palpably as officers grappled with the new reality. Sergeant Smith emphasized that Davis's dismissal wasn't just about punishment, but about setting a standard for expected conduct within the department. She announced new training protocols focusing on racial sensitivity and de-escalation tactics, requiring officers to attend monthly workshops. As the dust began to settle, attention turned to the future. How could the department prevent similar incidents from occurring? The path ahead was clear but challenging, requiring ongoing effort and vigilance from both law enforcement and the community they served. In his apartment, James Davis sat in stunned silence, the weight of his actions and their consequences finally sinking in. His career was over, but perhaps he realized something more important had begun, a real chance for change in a system that had for too long resisted it. With Davis's dismissal sending shockwaves through the department, Sergeant Laura Smith knew the real work was just beginning. She threw herself into overhauling department policies, determined to transform words into action. Late nights in her office became the norm as she pored over stacks of reports and recommendations, crafting new guidelines that would reshape how officers interacted with the community. The rollout of these changes was met with a mix of reactions. Some officers embraced the new focus on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity, eager to rebuild trust with the community they served. Others bristled at what they perceived as unnecessary restrictions, their voices rising in heated debates during training sessions. Smith stood firm, her eyes blazing with determination as she addressed her team. These changes aren't just about following new rules, she emphasized. They're about fundamentally shifting how we approach our role as protectors of this community. The redesigned training programs became a crucible for this transformation. Role-playing exercises forced officers to confront their biases and practice de-escalation techniques in high-pressure scenarios. Cultural sensitivity workshops opened eyes to the diverse experiences within their community, challenging long-held assumptions. Perhaps the most significant change was the implementation of a comprehensive system for tracking and analyzing officer behavior. Every interaction, every use of force incident was now meticulously documented and reviewed. The data collected would serve as both a mirror for individual officers to reflect on their actions and a roadmap for the department's ongoing improvement. As weeks turned into months, the impact of these changes began to materialize. Complaints against officers saw a marked decrease. Use of force incidents dropped by 30%, a statistic that brought a rare smile to Smith's face when she reviewed the quarterly report. More subtle but equally important were the shifts in community perception. Residents who had once viewed police with suspicion now engaged in friendly conversations during neighborhood patrols. Local businesses reported feeling more supported rather than targeted. Officer Maria Rodriguez, initially skeptical of the changes, found herself transformed by the new approach. "I used to see every situation as a potential threat," she admitted during a debriefing. "Now I'm looking for ways to de-escalate, to really listen to people. It's making a difference." As trust began to rebuild between the police and the community, Smith knew their work was far from over. Sustaining these positive changes and expanding their reach would require ongoing effort and vigilance. But for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope that they were on the right path, one step closer to becoming the department their community deserved. As news of the sweeping changes in Adams' local police department spread, a ripple effect began to take hold across the nation. Police chiefs from neighboring precincts, intrigued by the positive outcomes, reached out to Sergeant Laura Smith for guidance. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from curious colleagues, eager to learn about the reforms that had transformed her department. Smith found herself juggling her regular duties with impromptu mentoring sessions, sharing insights on implementing bias training and community engagement initiatives. She spoke candidly about the challenges they'd faced, the resistance from some officers, and the gradual shift in departmental culture. Her honesty resonated with many of her peers, who saw reflections of their own struggles in her words. As word spread further, a tension began to build in police departments across the country. Some embraced the call for change, recognizing the need for a new approach to policing. Others dug in their heels, resistant to what they perceived as an attack on traditional law enforcement methods. Heated debates erupted in precincts, with officers and leadership alike grappling with the implications of such widespread reform. Meanwhile, General Michael Adams found himself thrust into the national spotlight. His eloquent advocacy for change caught the attention of organizers planning a national conference on police reform. They extended an invitation for him to deliver the keynote address, recognizing the power of his personal experience to drive home the urgency of the issue. Adams stood at the podium, his words carrying weight as he addressed a sea of law enforcement professionals, politicians, and community leaders. He spoke of his ordeal, not with bitterness, but with a call to action. "This isn't about pointing finger," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "It's about recognizing a systemic problem and having the courage to address it head on." His speech resonated deeply, sparking intense discussions in the conference halls and beyond. Police academies across the country began incorporating the incident as a case study in their training programs. Cadets pored over the details, analyzing each decision point and discussing alternative approaches rooted in de-escalation and community trust. As weeks turned into months, a movement for widespread reform began to gain momentum. What had started as one unjust arrest in a quiet suburban neighborhood was now transforming the landscape of policing on a larger scale. Departments that had implemented changes reported decreased complaints, improved community relations, and a renewed sense of purpose among officers. The impact extended far beyond individual precincts. Lawmakers and policy experts took notice, recognizing the need for systemic change at a higher level. As the focus expanded to legislative action, it became clear that the ripples from Adams' encounter had set in motion a wave of transformation that would reshape the very foundations of law enforcement in America. What had begun as a local incident in a quiet suburban neighborhood now reverberated through the halls of power. General Adams' story caught the attention of state and federal lawmakers, igniting a fierce debate on racial profiling and police accountability. As the narrative spread, proposals for new legislation addressing these issues gained traction, with politicians on both sides of the aisle recognizing the urgent need for reform. The air crackled with tension as police unions and reform advocates clashed over the proposed changes. Union representatives argued that stricter regulations would hamper officers' ability to perform their duties effectively, while reform advocates pointed to cases like Adams's as evidence of systemic bias that demanded immediate action. The schism between these groups deepened, their arguments growing more heated with each passing day. Public hearings became the battleground for this ideological conflict. Adams, composed yet resolute, took his seat before a panel of lawmakers. His voice steady, he recounted his experience, painting a vivid picture of the humiliation and fear he felt during his unjust arrest. The room fell silent as he spoke, his words cutting through the political rhetoric and touching on a fundamental truth about equality and justice. As Adams' testimony concluded, the debate over police reform surged to the forefront of national discourse. News outlets ran constant coverage, dissecting every proposed measure and its potential impact. Social media exploded with hashtags and viral videos, citizens sharing their own experiences with law enforcement and demanding change. In state legislatures and the halls of Congress, lawmakers engaged in heated debates. Some pushed for sweeping reforms, while others advocated for more measured approaches. The political landscape shifted as politicians staked out their positions, aware that their stance on this issue could make or break their careers. After months of negotiations and revisions, a series of new laws passed, mandating widespread accountability and training reforms for law enforcement agencies across the country. These measures included stricter reporting requirements for use of force incidents, mandatory body cameras for all officers, and comprehensive racial bias training programs. The impact of Adams's encounter now extended far beyond one police department, shaping national policy and setting a new standard for law enforcement practices. As the ink dried on these landmark bills, it became clear that the ripple effect from that fateful day had grown into a wave of change, washing over the entire criminal justice system. As the focus shifted to implementing these new laws and assessing their long-term effects, General Adams stood at his living room window, gazing out at the neighborhood where it all began. He felt a mix of pride and determination, knowing that while significant progress had been made, the journey towards true equality and justice was far from over. 12 months can change everything, or nothing at all. For General Adams and his community, the year following his wrongful arrest was a delicate balancing act between progress and pushback. As he stepped out onto the familiar streets, the air felt different, charged with both hope and lingering tension. Adams walked slowly, taking in the neighborhood he'd called home for years. The same trees lined the sidewalks, the same houses stood proud, but something had shifted beneath the surface. He noticed officers patrolling on foot, engaging in friendly conversations with residents. It was a far cry from the wary glances and hushed whispers of a year ago. At the police station, Sergeant Laura Smith pored over the latest statistics. The numbers were encouraging. Racial profiling incidents had decreased significantly since implementing new training and accountability measures. Yet she knew that numbers alone couldn't tell the whole story. The real test lay in the hearts and minds of both officers and community members. Smith had organized a follow-up community forum, determined to keep the lines of communication open. As people filed into the high school auditorium, she sensed a mix of emotions. Cautious optimism tinged with lingering frustration. The hard work of rebuilding trust was far from over. Officer Rodriguez stood before the crowd, her voice steady as she shared her experience with the new policies. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted. "Changing ingrained habits takes time and effort, but I've seen firsthand how these new approaches can de-escalate tense situations and build real connections with the people we serve." Other officers echoed her sentiments, speaking candidly about the challenges and rewards of the past year. Some community members nodded in agreement, while others raised pointed questions about ongoing issues. The discussions were frank, sometimes heated, but always rooted in a shared desire for progress. As the forum concluded, Smith presented the results of recent community surveys. The data showed a marked improvement in trust between the police and residents. It wasn't perfect, but it was a solid foundation to build upon. Later that evening, Adams and Smith sat in her office, reflecting on the year's journey. "We've made real stride," Adams said, his eyes thoughtful, "but there's still so much work to be done." Smith nodded, her expression determined. "This incident has become a landmark in our ongoing fight for equality. It's changed how we approach policing, not just here, but across the country. We can't lose momentum now." As they continued to discuss future plans and challenges, both knew that the true measure of change would be seen in the years to come. The incident that had shaken their community to its core had also planted the seeds of transformation. Now it was up to everyone, officers and citizens alike, to nurture those seeds and ensure they took root in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. As the sun rose over the city, General Michael Adams stepped onto the stage of Lincoln High School's auditorium. The faces of hundreds of students looked up at him, a mix of curiosity and anticipation in their eyes. Adams took a deep breath, his hand resting on the podium as he began to speak. His voice, steady and resolute, filled the room as he shared his story of injustice and the change it had sparked. Across town, Sergeant Laura Smith led a training session for visiting officers from neighboring precincts. The conference room buzzed with energy as she outlined the department's reform policies. "These changes aren't just about following new rules," she emphasized, her eyes scanning the room. "They're about fundamentally shifting how we approach our role as protectors of this community." Yet challenges persisted. A young officer, barely 6 months on the force, found himself facing disciplinary action after a heated encounter with a group of teenagers. The incident tested the new oversight systems, forcing the department to confront the reality that change was an ongoing process, not a single event. At the police academy, a new class of recruits filed into the lecture hall. Their instructor, a veteran officer with salt and pepper hair, stood before them. "You're entering a department that's undergone significant changes," he began, his voice carrying a note of pride. "The policies you'll learn here are designed to build trust, ensure accountability, and serve our community with respect." In City Hall, the Civilian Oversight Board convened for its monthly meeting. Community members, once wary of engaging with law enforcement, now participated actively in shaping police practices. Their voices, once ignored, now carried weight in decisions that affected their neighborhoods. As months passed, a new culture began to take root within the department. Officers who had initially resisted the changes found themselves embracing the new approach, recognizing the positive impact it had on their interactions with the community. Trust, slowly but surely, was being rebuilt. One evening, Adams stood in his living room, gazing out at the street where his ordeal had begun. He reflected on the journey of the past 2 years, from a moment of injustice to a movement for change. The incident that had shaken him to his core had become a catalyst for transformation, not just in his community, but across the nation. As he watched a patrol car roll slowly down the street, Adams felt a mix of emotions: pride in the progress made, determination to continue the fight, and hope for a future where such incidents would become relics of the past. The story of his wrongful arrest had become more than just a personal ordeal. It was now a testament to the power of speaking out and demanding change. Adam's story had sparked change, but could it reshape an entire generation of law enforcement? As he watched that patrol car, little did he know that across town, a revolution was brewing in the halls of the police academy. The faces of future officers were about to look very different, in more ways than one. Inside the academy, instructors pored over new curriculum materials, their brows furrowed in concentration. The overhauled program placed community relations at its core, with modules on cultural sensitivity, de-escalation techniques, and the history of systemic racism in policing. Role-playing exercises simulated tense encounters, challenging cadets to find peaceful resolutions. A diverse group of recruits filed into the lecture hall, their eyes bright with determination. Many cited the reforms sparked by Adams' case as their inspiration for joining the force. They brought fresh perspectives, eager to be part of the change they wanted to see in law enforcement. Not everyone embraced the new direction. Veteran officers grumbled during mandatory retraining sessions, their arms crossed as they listened to lectures on implicit bias. "We didn't sign up for this social work nonsense," one muttered, earning nods from some colleagues. Others, however, found themselves reconsidering long-held beliefs, slowly opening up to new approaches. The academy doors opened wider, inviting community members to participate in training sessions. Residents from various backgrounds shared their experiences with law enforcement, both positive and negative. Cadets listened intently, their notepads filling with insights that no textbook could provide. General Adams became a frequent visitor to the academy, his presence a living reminder of why these changes mattered. He mentored aspiring officers, sharing his own journey and the lessons he'd learned. "Your badge is a symbol of trust," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Never forget the responsibility that comes with it." Months of rigorous training culminated in a graduation ceremony unlike any before it. The class that stood proudly in their crisp uniforms reflected the diversity of the community they would serve. Their faces showed a mix of excitement and solemnity, aware of the challenges that lay ahead, but committed to a new vision of equitable policing. As the new officers dispersed to their assigned precincts, the impact was immediately noticeable. The department's demographics shifted, better reflecting the neighborhoods they patrolled. Citizens began to see themselves represented in the faces behind the badges, a small but significant step in rebuilding trust. While challenges remained and old habits died hard, the seeds of change had taken root. As Adams watched this new generation of officers begin their careers, he felt a cautious optimism. The ripples from his ordeal had grown into a wave, reshaping not just policies, but the very fabric of law enforcement culture. The true test would come as these officers faced the realities of the streets, carrying with them the hope for a more just and equitable future. As the sun rose over the city, the headlines in the local newspaper caught General Adams' eye. Instead of the usual reports of conflict between police and residents, the front page featured a story about a successful community cleanup event where officers and neighbors worked side by side to beautify a local park. Adams smiled, recognizing the shift in media coverage as a small but significant step towards healing the deep-seated mistrust that had plagued their community for so long. Across town, Officer Rodriguez adjusted her uniform, preparing for another day on the beat. As she walked through the neighborhood, she noticed a change in the air. Gone were the suspicious glances and hushed whispers that had once greeted her presence. Instead, residents offered friendly nods and waves. A local shopkeeper even invited her in for a cup of coffee, eager to discuss plans for an upcoming neighborhood watch program. At Lincoln High School, Mr. Thompson's civics class was abuzz with excitement. The teacher had invited a panel of speakers, including both police officers and community activists, to discuss the history of civil rights and the importance of positive police-community interactions. As the students listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, Thompson couldn't help but feel a sense of hope for the future. The transformation wasn't limited to classrooms and street corners. Local businesses, once wary of increased police presence, now actively supported community policing efforts. The Chamber of Commerce sponsored a series of Coffee with a Cop events, providing neutral ground for officers and residents to engage in open dialogue. These gatherings, once sparsely attended, now drew crowds eager to build bridges of understanding. As weeks turned into months, the cumulative effect of these efforts became impossible to ignore. A citywide survey revealed a significant improvement in public perception of law enforcement. Residents reported feeling safer, more respected, and more willing to cooperate with police in solving community issues. Perhaps nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the very neighborhood where General Adams had been wrongfully arrested. The street corner that had once been a symbol of injustice now hosted an annual block party where officers and residents alike gathered to celebrate their shared commitment to a safer, more equitable community. Adams stood on his front porch, watching children play freely in the street, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of a passing patrol car. He felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in the progress made, determination to continue the work, and a cautious optimism for the future. The incident that had shaken him to his core had become a catalyst for change, its ripple effects extending far beyond the boundaries of their city. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the peaceful street, Adams knew that their journey was far from over. The transformation of community perceptions was just the beginning. The real challenge lay in sustaining this progress and pushing for even deeper societal change. With renewed determination, he stepped back inside, ready to face whatever challenges the future might hold. The ripples from General Adams' encounter with Officer Davis had grown into waves, crashing against the shores of institutions far beyond law enforcement. Universities, corporations, and government agencies began scrutinizing their own practices, uncomfortable questions bubbling to the surface. Were they perpetuating the same biases that had led to Adams's unjust arrest? In boardrooms and faculty lounges, conversations about racial equality took on a new urgency. The incident had sparked a national reckoning, forcing people to confront the uncomfortable truth that prejudice still lurked beneath the surface of polite society. Tensions simmered as some pushed for sweeping changes, while others resisted, clinging to the familiar. Adams found himself thrust into the role of reluctant spokesperson, his story becoming a rallying cry for those demanding systemic change. He spoke at conferences and wrote op-eds, his measured words carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "This isn't just about policing," he would say, his voice steady. "It's about the unconscious biases we all carry and the systems that reinforce them." As the months passed, researchers began studying the long-term effects of the reforms implemented in Adams' community. They pored over crime statistics, analyzed survey data, and conducted interviews with residents and officers alike. The initial findings were promising. Reports of racial profiling had decreased, and community trust in law enforcement was on the rise. But the path forward wasn't smooth. Old prejudices died hard, and for every step forward, there seemed to be a half step back. A viral video of another unjust arrest would spark outrage, threatening to undo months of progress. Yet each time the response was swifter, the accountability more certain. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a shift began to take hold. It wasn't just in policies or procedures, but in the very fabric of society. People became more aware of their own biases, more willing to challenge assumptions. The language around race and justice evolved, becoming more nuanced and empathetic. As the third anniversary of his arrest approached, Adams stood before a crowd at the Lincoln Memorial. The symbolism wasn't lost on him or the thousands gathered to hear him speak. "What happened to me was a single incident," he said, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. "But it exposed a deep wound in our nation's soul. Today we stand at a crossroads. We can choose to ignore that wound, to let it fester and divide us further. Or we can face it head on, with courage and compassion, and begin the hard work of healing." The crowd erupted in applause, a mix of determination and hope washing over the gathered masses. As Adams stepped back from the podium, he knew that the work was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirrings of real, lasting change. The incident that had shaken him to his core had become a turning point in the ongoing struggle for civil rights. A reminder that progress, though slow, was possible. General Michael Adams stood at the podium, his eyes scanning the diverse crowd gathered before him. The journey from that fateful day of his unjust arrest to this moment of widespread change seemed almost surreal. He took a deep breath, his voice steady as he began to speak. "What began as a single incident has sparked a transformation in our society," Adams said, his words carrying the weight of hard-won experience. "But we must remember that the fight for equality and justice is far from over. It requires constant vigilance and active participation from all of us." The audience listened intently as Adams continued. "We need to hold each other accountable if we see something that isn't right. We need to speak up. It's about building trust through action." His eyes swept across the crowd, meeting the gaze of officers, community leaders, and everyday citizens alike. "The path forward isn't easy," Adams acknowledged, his jaw tightening slightly. "But together, we can create the change we want to see in our communities. It starts with each one of us, every day, making the choice to stand up for what's right." As Adams concluded his speech, a sense of determination filled the air. The crowd rose to their feet, applauding not just the man before them, but the vision of a more just and equitable future he represented. The ripples of change that had begun with one unjust arrest continued to spread, touching lives far beyond that quiet suburban street where it all began.